Recently in Venezuela, thousands of workers marched to commemorate the coup defeat of the 2002 U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela, where the U.S. worked together with Venezuelan elites, Venezuelan capitalists, the Venezuelan ruling class, as well as Venezuelan elites and corrupt officials within the military, to oust Hugo Chavez. However, thousands and thousands of Venezuelan people got out in the streets and demanded that Chavez be returned, demanded that their sovereignty be protected, and forced the Venezuelan military into action. And Chavez was actually put back in power after 48 hours of being ousted by the U.S. So this is considered to be a great defeat of imperialism and a great defeat of the U.S. empire at the hands of the Bolivarian Revolution and the Venezuelan working class, the Venezuelan proletariat. Recently in 2022 here, they had a big ceremony to commemorate the anniversary of this event, where millions of people were marching in the streets, or hundreds of thousands of people were marching in the streets. An incredible show of support for the revolution and against imperialism. And this is sort of seen as a turning point in Venezuela, because before this, Hugo Chavez was fairly friendly with the U.S. He had said, we're not going to be the same as Cuba generally. Cuba was very anti-U.S. And Fidel Castro actually warned Chavez, don't trust the U.S. And Chavez was like, it'll be all right. But after this coup, it was a major turning point for the revolution, where the workers realized they needed to arm themselves and organize themselves against the possibility of counter-revolution or of imperialist infiltration by the U.S. And Chavez basically realized at that point he couldn't trust the U.S. at all. And anytime anything socialistic anything he did to develop the economy of Venezuela for the benefit of Venezuelans, the U.S. was going to try and interrupt so they could continue exploiting Venezuela. So big turning point for them, which is why it's now something that's celebrated years later. And I want to talk about how a lot of people talk about Venezuela, and including some socialists, critique them in this way, like it's this top-down revolution. Right, like it's this revolution where Hugo Chavez, this military commander, just took power. Or they view it as not a real revolution because they took power via the ballot box. They voted Hugo Chavez into power, so therefore it's not a real revolution of the workers. But these workers are armed, and in 2005, Chavez created the Bolivarian Civilian Military Union, which would later become an actual part of the Venezuelan army. And this is basically an armed militia, an armed union of workers whose stated objective is to protect Venezuelan sovereignty. So, the typical Marxist-Leninist theory says that the workers are going to arm themselves, overthrow the state apparatus, replace the state apparatus with organs of armed workers. And armed workers protect the revolution from counter-revolution or from imperialist infiltration, like we said. And that's what Venezuela has, right? They didn't just vote Hugo Chavez into power and call it a day. They voted him into power, but then the U.S. tried to overthrow Chavez in a violent coup. So the workers had to arm themselves and had to organize themselves and defend themselves if they wanted to defend the revolution. I guess some people say it's like, kind of act like it's not like a real revolution, right? Because Venezuela's economy is mostly still privately owned, right? They haven't made most of their economy public yet or nationalized a lot of major industries. They still have a very capitalistic economy. With these social programs mostly tied to oil revenue to try and raise people's living standards. And there are some other aspects of Bolivarian socialism, but a lot of people critique them because they're not socialist enough. But I think we forget about the level of grassroots support and the level of grassroots organization that exists in Venezuela, especially compared to a country like the U.S. And we fail to realize that all of these people are still struggling for a revolution, struggling against capitalism and for socialism. So here's a really cool video that was taken of Chavistas and the armed workers of Venezuela marching in the streets to commemorate the defeat of the 2002 U.S. coup. So yeah, cool stuff there. Big fan of Venezuela. Big fan of the Bolivarian Revolution. We don't want to be like Cuba is a major red flag. Yeah, I mean, there's division in. So, like, there have been a lot of social democrats or socialistic presidents, especially recently, who have come to power in Latin America, and they say, we're different than Cuba, right? We're different than Cuba or China. We're not like this violent Marxist, we're not, we didn't take power via violent revolution. We didn't seize power of the government like that. We don't have a one-party state. We're not as anti-imperialism, as anti-US as like Cuba. So they just try and be a little softer, and candidates have to do that a lot of times to get elected. They have to kind of badmouth Cuba because the Red Scare, McCarthyism was a thing in Latin America too. The CIA did everything they could to spread anti-communist ideology throughout Latin America, including launching massive killing and torturing campaigns of anybody with left-wing ideas. Just as recently as the 1970s with Operation Condor, or the 80s with the backing of the Contras and their paramilitary death squads in Nicaragua. So